And joining us now is Charles Ficner. He is former director of Strategic Studies Office for the National Research Council. And Charles, we welcome you to TVO. It's nice to have you here.
It's nice to be here, thanks.
Let's tell your story. You own some land in eastern Ontario in Lanark County, right?
That's correct.
How much?
200 acres.
200 acres. Do you pay regular property taxes on that land as if you owned a house in a big city, that kind of thing?
Yes, I do.
Are there valuable minerals under your land?
No, not according to anything I have heard, and not according to a letter that I've received from the Assistant Deputy Minister of Ministry of Northern Development and Mines some long time ago, saying there was absolutely nothing of any known value under my land.
Do you pay an additional tax on that land as if there were minerals under it?
On half of the property, I do.
Why?
That's a very interesting, an interesting question.
That's why I asked it, Charles.
It's a complicated one to answer. There is no legal basis for the levying of the tax on my property, but the ministry has levied it nonetheless.
What is the tax?
The tax is called the mining lands tax. It was formerly called the acreage tax, and it was authorized in 1907 initially to tax properties that were in areas that were not within municipalities and that were sold with a requirement that they had to be mined. Those properties not being in municipalities were not subject to municipal or school taxes, and since they were granted only for the purpose of mining them, if they weren't being mined, the purpose of the tax was to keep track of them and to have the properties returned to the Crown if they ceased being mined and weren't any longer being used.
So there's no minerals under your land that
No.
anybody knows of?
No.
And yet you are paying this extra mining tax anyway?
I have to pay it. It's currently at about 2.5 times as much as the combined municipal and school taxes. And if I don't pay it, the government will take it away from me. They've made it clear. They said the purpose of the tax, or the tax is intended as a means of returning land to the Crown. The Crown doesn't pay anything to the people whose lands are returned for non-payment of the tax. The Crown doesn't benefit. Instead, the Crown gives the confiscated properties to mining companies for their private benefit.
Okay, we want to follow the path of your opposition to this tax, because this is not something that developed overnight. You have actually been fighting against this for almost 2 decades.
That's correct.
At Queen's Park. You first started when the NDP was in power, Bob Rae was premier.
That's correct.
You brought it to their attention, and what happened?
Initially, when the announcement came out from officials that they were putting the tax up to a rate of 3.5 times the combined municipal and school taxes, I got in touch with the Assistant Deputy Minister of Northern Development and Mines, whose name was at the bottom of this background sheet. And he said, oh, big mistake, not supposed to apply to you, supposed to be north of the French River, none of these Southern Ontario properties. Deal with one of my staff and she will resolve it. Well, it didn't get resolved through the staff member. Eventually, I ended up talking with the minister, and the minister at that time, Gilles Pouliot, the NDP minister, initial minister.
Who's from the north?
Who is from the north. I had written a letter and asked to meet with him, and a telephone call was arranged. And he, after that call, sent me a letter saying the tax is intended as a means of returning land to the Crown. I then entered into some discussion with officials, a senior lawyer in the ministry. He offered, if I didn't discuss this widely, that they would make some special arrangements and stop taxing me. I said that didn't sound right, because I had found enough by this time to realize that I wasn't the only one who had been illegally taxed.
So there are others?
There are many others. And many others, there are not many others who are still being taxed. There are many others who were taxed and didn't pay it and had either the land or just the minerals under the land confiscated, and then those minerals are made available to mining companies. So I said, it doesn't sound right to give me a special deal. We've got Section 15 in the Charter. Everyone is entitled to equal benefit of the law without discrimination. Doesn't sound like the right deal. He then said, well, don't take us to court. I advise you not to, because it'll cost you a great deal of money. And I said, are you telling me you'll drag the case out and bankrupt me before it ever gets to the court? And he said, I'm telling you, I'll do absolutely everything it takes to make sure we don't lose this.
Who said this again?
This was a senior lawyer for the Ministry of Northern Development and Mines.
And this is now, what, 15, 16, 17 years ago?
This is, it was actually about 18 years,
18 years ago. Okay. That obviously did not dissuade you.
No, I didn't think this was quite right. So what I then did is I went to my MPP and I looked at the legislation, and it was quite clear to me that it didn't allow the tax. And so I went to my MPP and said, look, let's go to the legislature and find out if they really do intend to use the tax as a means of confiscating property from citizens so they can paying them nothing so they can give it to mining companies. And with the legislative drafting staff, I worked with them. A private member's bill was introduced. And I then wrote to all MPPs encouraging them to support that private member's bill. It went to first reading, but didn't go to second or third reading. But following putting that bill before the House and me writing the letter, the minister at that time, Shelley Martel, signed a letter to some MPPs, how many I don't know, in which she made a number of statements that I thought were false. But also she used some private information of mine about me. She misrepresented that, and it was all an attempt, as I saw it, to discredit me and say, ignore this guy. I went to the Premier at the time, Bob Rae, on many occasions saying, deal with the policy issue. There's an illegal levying of a tax. You're confiscating property from citizens to give it to mining companies. It's just not right morally, and it's not legal.
What did he do?
I got 3 letters back from him, and the third one said essentially get lost. So I did get lost to the Information and Privacy Commissioner.
Well, hold on, before you go there, do you know that if the Premier even saw them, or was it just a staffer who probably dealt with this?
They were signed by the Premier, so the Premier is accountable. But what I will say is I took the 3 letters and I've held them up to a window, one over the other, and the signatures are identical. So they were clearly signed by machine. But nonetheless, the message was get lost. So,
okay. Now, before you go on to the Ombudsman...
Well, Privacy Commissioner first.
Excuse me, Privacy Commissioner first. This is a long story, isn't it? Shelley Martel had to resign because of the information that she revealed that was private. Isn't that right?
That's correct. The Privacy Commissioner conducted a 6-month investigation and concluded that she had, in fact, broken the privacy laws. And after a 30-day delay, she was forced to resign. From my perspective, it was good that the issue came forward, and I hoped the substantive policy issue would come forward, but it didn't get covered.
Okay. So you went to the Privacy Commissioner. After that, you went to the Ombudsman.
That's correct.
Which is an arm of the Ontario government.
That's correct.
Designed to look into complaints from citizens.
That's correct.
They looked into it, and what did they find?
Well, they conducted an investigation for about 10 years. It was frustrated initially by officials in the ministry, and eventually, there were a lot of twists and turns over the 10 years, but as the Ombudsman was coming to a final conclusion on this and beginning to get towards producing a report, the ministry lawyers argued that he had no legal jurisdiction to even hear the case because I hadn't taken the ministry to a quasi-judicial body beforehand, incurred the legal expense of charging the government. And if you look at the Ombudsman's Act, sure enough, it says that he is an appeal body of last resort, and they could argue, yes, that I could have gone to court or to this quasi-judicial body.
So bottom line, no help there.
He closed the file.
Closed the file. Now, when the Liberals got back into power, this I guess is 03.
Yes.
You had a chat with Rick Bartolucci?
I didn't have a chat. In fact, at the end of the Ombudsman's letter, he actually said to me, there was a note in there that the 2 ministries that had levied this tax historically were each prepared to pay me $5,000 on the condition that I agree that my complaint had been addressed. I tried to discuss that with the Ombudsman. He said, it's not my offer, and I'm not able to discuss it. And no one from any of the ministries would discuss it, so the whole place went quiet. They just weren't dealing with me. So at the end of the Harris government time, I went to my MPP, who was a Liberal, and discussed this with him, and he said, when we form the government, we will get this fixed. So through his office, I could get nothing from the officials. They just wouldn't respond.
But then they did become the government.
But then they did become the government, and through my MPP's office, eventually Mr. Bartolucci sent a letter confirming that his ministry would in fact pay $5,000, and the Ministry of Natural Resources would pay another $5,000 on the condition that I agreed that my complaint that they had broken the law had been addressed.
And let me guess, Charles, you didn't take the money.
It didn't seem to me to be a very smart thing to do. In fact, I wrote to the government, I wrote to the Attorney General, and I asked, having spoken to a retired judge who spoke with another, and said, this doesn't seem right. If I said to a police officer who caught me speeding, I'll give you $100 on the condition that you agree that your complaint that I've broken the speeding laws has been addressed, we know what would happen to me. Mm-hmm. And the judge said to me, you're absolutely right. It's a violation of the criminal code, in his view. And so I then went to the Attorney General and said, there's this big policy issue here that I want you to deal with, and it's being covered up by all of these steps by the government, never trying not to deal with these issues. Please deal with it. He never responded. Never responded. You ask again, he never responds. I went to the Premier and said, I'm writing to you because I've been trying to get the Attorney General to deal with this, and he won't respond. Would you please deal with it? No response. I write again. The Premier then writes back and says, I understand that you're having a conversation with the Attorney General. I encourage you to continue.
This is great. Okay. Let's appreciate and understand the issue of this tax, which you believe to be illegal and don't think you should have to pay, and this has been a nearly 20-year fight. But there's another issue here which concerns you a lot, which is the power of mining companies and whether or not it's too big. What is your issue with the mining companies exactly?
My experience is very small. When you get involved in a position like this, you eventually start to say, something is going on here. They're not wanting to resolve this. They want to hush it. They want to give me special deals to get me out of the picture. What is actually behind this? So you start to look in great detail in the Mining Act, the Mining Tax Act, and you begin to, it becomes very clear that what the government has done through the Mining Ministry of Northern Development and Mines is to give extraordinary privileges to mining firms.
Like what?
Well, for example, in 2007, the ministry says they extracted $10.7 billion worth of minerals out of the province of Ontario. They paid not 1 cent in royalties. So the citizens of the province got nothing in royalties for all that. Now, we know that Alberta, in its oil, is seen as one of the lowest oil royalty takers in the world. But at least they get some royalties. Here in Ontario, we get none.
But is it possible that the Ontario government has looked at the same facts you have and has just come to a different conclusion? Namely, we don't want to be taxing them and putting this royalty regime in place because we want them mining, we want them creating jobs, we want them buying equipment here. It's good for Ontario.
Well, they might have come to that conclusion, but it's hard to see how that could be the case. Mining accounts for, all the mining activities account for 0.4% of GDP in Ontario. It's trivial. The number of jobs in mining is about 15,000 by the ministry's own numbers. That's about 0.2% of the population, let's say 0.6% of the jobs. And many of those jobs would occur anyway.
You and some like-minded people have put together a group in hopes of getting some changes to the way mining happens in this province.
Yes.
What would you like to see happen?
The group is called the Coalition for Balanced Mining Act Reform. The government knows it has to make some changes because there have been so many problems, people being jailed and so on over the last year. And we've proposed 3 very modest changes. One is to treat all property owners the same. Currently 98.6% of property owners in the South own the minerals. We're saying that 1.4% that you've taken the minerals away, give them back. Treat everyone the same and allow those property owners not to be subjected to mining companies coming on and effectively kicking them off their land. Allow municipal plans, municipalities are required to make official plans, allow those plans to cover mining. Don't allow any longer the mining ministry to come in and say the highest and best use is mining and override all land use planning decisions, which is what's done now. And the third is, before mineral exploration takes place, there would be a comprehensive assessment of the potential adverse impacts before the work takes place.
Okay, let's finish up here on the tax itself.
Yes.
Where are you with that now?
For the first time in the 20 years, I've actually had a meeting with the Deputy Minister of Northern Development and Mines. During the consultation process, I spoke with the minister. I guess he was starting to feel heat. I was working with a member of his staff saying, I'm getting nowhere with the bureaucracy. They absolutely refuse. They say they won't even respond to any further letters from me, any communications at all. And so the new deputy did meet. He wasn't ready to speak to any of the points that I had raised or any of the legal arguments in the thousands of pages that have been submitted over the last 18 years. But he did listen, and he did ask me to submit it again in writing. So I submitted it again in writing, and it's now back in the ministry, and we'll see.
Are you paying this tax, and have you been over the years?
I have no choice. If I don't pay it, my property, the officials sign a document, which is called a forfeiture document. They go register it in the land titles office. They then make the property available to any mining company that wants to come in and say, this is mine.
Don't take this the wrong way, but some people could listen to this story. You've been fighting, you know, as they say, fighting City Hall for almost 2 decades now, and they could conclude that, Charles, you're a real pain in the ass. Now, would you dissuade them of that conclusion?
Well, I wouldn't dissuade them that I am a pain in the ass if what they want to do is wrong, if they want to break the law. But we live in a country that's supposed to have laws that mean something. And if I look at the country, my son wants my property once I'm gone, and I want him to have it free from this burden of abuse by officials. And I think if we've got a charter that says that every individual is equal under the law, I think we have to fight for those things.
No, fair enough, but some people would not be prepared to spend 20 years of their life doing it. What is it about you that allows you to spend this much time on, quite frankly, what at the end of the day is a convoluted, complicated feature of the mining tax of this province?
I was a federal executive and helped develop a number of policies and programs, some of which resulted in spending several billions of dollars. I think the job of a public servant is to serve the public, and I think it's an important profession. Government matters. But when government does wrong things, when it does damage, and people don't say anything, then our system gets worse. And I left the government quite a number of years ago, and I've been writing on matters related to ethics, principle, and government, looking at how one might get change to make our government more accountable, more respected by citizens. And that's a way that I would see getting voters up, getting more participation, by building respect rather than having something that's seen as fighting citizens. I've had the time, I've had the ability. Having been in the government, I know how the system works. I know something about the legal process. I've seen the government use its power federally against people who had a good case, the government's lawyers. I don't think it's right. And I think if people who know what's going on don't do something about it when they have the opportunity, it makes the country worse.
Charles, it's good of you to come into TVO tonight and share your story with us and inform us about this. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much for having me.